We all unmuted now? Hello there. Welcome to day one of this International Education Summit brokered by the Australian Technology Network of Universities. I'm Geraldine Doogue, and I am to be your moderator throughout these very exciting next 3 days. But before we go any further, I would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose ancestral lands UTS sits. And this is where I'm sitting at the moment, and delighted to be so. Look, it's a very timely discussion, this 3 days that we're going to have. I hope a lot of you can stay for the whole 3 days. I think we'll be extremely grateful by the end of proceedings because it's very ambitious, the goals and the lineup set by the organisers of the conference. I think they really have done us proud with their ambition for how we might discuss this topic. And I honestly have to say, I can't remember a conference being presented to me with quite such a scope of reference and such a marvellous array of people to try to make this topic very accessible, because as we know, there have been a great deal of headlines lately, and we're going to try to get underneath some of that. There'll be 2 sessions each day, and I'll do my best to match the organisers' ambitions by trying to move things through fast. And hopefully by the end of the 3 days, let alone the first day, we'll all be a lot wiser. We're not trying to explore necessarily the intricacies of funding or numbers. I mean, I know that'll come up, but that's not the goal. We're really trying to explore what you might call the broader context within which the technology universities operate, their relationship to the states and regions' economies, how students experience Australian universities, and whether this COVID time, with all its disruption and its sort of total oddness, really might warn us, I suppose, that we have to usher in a new set of offerings, for a new set of attitudes for the future, in whatever might be described as a new era, I suppose, and how all this might play into what you might see as promoting geopolitical cooperation, an area that particularly fascinates me and animates quite a lot of my work at the ABC, and which I think has been somewhat under-discussed. So that's the scope of what we're going to try to do, and as I hope you agree, it's more than the usual. So we're not going to dodge difficult areas, but we will try to be constructive and to emphasise some of the practical yields of this amazing sector, and why, you might say, well, why hasn't that been done better before? Well, it's a good question, but you never waste a good crisis, and it seems to me anyway to have prompted people to think, to put words to things that might have been intangible and assumed in the past, and that's really what we're going to try to do over these next 3 days, to really nail down some of the clear-cut contributions made by universities. But before I introduce our first panel, I'd like to welcome the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, Senator Simon Birmingham, who's going to welcome us via this short video message.
Good morning, and thank you for the chance to join you at this week's Australian Technology Network of Universities conference. We'd all wish to be able to be there in person, but I appreciate the chance to join you virtually and congratulate you all for engaging in these important discussions at this critical time. There's no question that 2020 has been and continues to be the most challenging of years. COVID-19 is having far-reaching consequences on Australia's economy, global economies, and of course, our higher education sector. Our tourism and education sectors are Australia's largest services exports, worth a combined $66 billion in 2019. The absence of visitors is being keenly felt in these sectors. But we are a resilient nation, and we have many reasons to be optimistic about what the future holds for our country and for the international education sector. International education and the students who come and study here are a critical part of Australia's community and of campus life. We acknowledge that their plans have been severely disrupted by the pandemic. the contribution of international education to our society more generally is important and highly valued. The presence of international students benefits our tourism, hospitality and retail sectors, all of whom have been significantly disrupted by COVID. We know that 1 in 4 students have family or friends who usually visit them while they're studying here in Australia. In 2019, this resulted in more than 300,000 visitors spending almost $1 billion, enjoying some 117,000 visits across regional Australia. Sadly, all of that is missing in 2020, and the rebuild is going to be a tough one from here. Studying in Australia, we know, is not only about learning and preparing for a career, it's about experiencing another culture and visiting unique places. International students enrich our communities with their food, their culture, their diversity, new knowledge, perspectives and global networks and different ways of thinking. Ultimately, international education is a long-term investment in building new relationships between countries, between individuals that will help to drive stronger people-to-people, business-to-business, government-to-government links long into the future. Our government is working where we can to take a considered and staged approach, aligned with expert medical advice, to provide surety and confidence to students and, where we can, to the broader sector. We're committed to working with the states and territories, where we can, on international student pilots, and look forward to welcoming international students back to Australia when conditions allow. In the interim, there have been many other ways that I know you, as higher education providers, have worked to engage with international students despite the constraints imposed by COVID-19, and importantly, to support them, for which we warmly thank you. Australians are renowned for being early adopters of innovation. We indeed established some of the very first global offerings around distance learning, looking back to our schools of the air. And this pandemic has meant that we've again had to move rapidly with the times, hardening our resolve to continue to expand the value proposition of studying in Australia to also include new ways of studying with Australia, using technology developed by Australian universities and EdTech service providers. I commend the sector for the extraordinary effort that has been shown this year to show an ability to adapt and innovate and to help students through these extraordinary challenges by allowing them to engage in a range of different remote learning opportunities. We've seen some wonderful examples. UTS has responded swiftly to COVID by setting up 3 online learning centres in China, 1 in Vietnam, providing a physical learning space and additional support for UTS students studying online. UTS, for example, has also been working with Telstra to upskill workers to meet the demands of rapidly changing job markets, the digitising economy, offering micro-credentials, as many of you have, for the first time in areas like data analysis, artificial intelligence and machine learning. These sorts of short, often 8-week programs developed in conjunction with tech companies like Telstra to address the anticipated shortfall of 60,000 information and communication technology workers in Australia are about providing new opportunities and choices to our domestic students and to those internationally. Australian universities like Deakin, Monash and QUT have been among the highest ranked in the world for their offering of massive open online courses, or MOOCs, presented in response to COVID, again expanding that choice and offering. We know also that through platforms like Vigo, student support platform that connects students with mental health support, academic and peer mentoring via chat, online video sessions and in-person one-on-one or group sessions, we're again harnessing technology to help with the human side of handling the pandemic. As a government, the Study with Australia pilot campaign that Austrade is developing is about offering students in the world 52 free online courses from Australian higher education and English language training providers, It's resulted in more than 860,000 enrolments in 224 countries. This is whetting the appetite, if you like, of many students who hopefully we can convert to ultimately studying here in Australia. The foundations of Australia's international education sector remain as strong as ever. High quality English language learning in a safe and welcoming country. Indeed, many of those foundations have been strengthened by our successful management of COVID and by the relative positioning we have against competitor nations in terms of the safety and community harmony that Australia has to offer. We are committed to working with the sector to rebuild student numbers in the years to come, to make sure that we do leverage those strong foundations for success. But we will need all of you to continue to show the same commitment to quality, to innovation, and to technology in positioning Australia as the ongoing world leader in international education, so that we emerge from this crisis even stronger and can seize the global demand that there will continue to be for the type of opportunities that you all create. Thank you once again for the chance to speak with you today, and I do wish all of you every success as we work through these challenges, but to seize the opportunities of the future.
And thank you, Senator Birmingham, for those words. I must say all that adaptability is really a very, it's a lovely story, isn't it? And it's wonderful to hear it as a backdrop to our conversations. We're going to probably be speaking more about the impact within the community, and but it's really good to have that backdrop sketched to us, and let's hope you're right about all your predictions. Now, our first session is international education creating jobs, and this effort to really actually situate international education in the broader real economy, which there's a sense the organisers believe, and I must say I agree with them, that hasn't really been done. Now we have 5 guests, and I think I'll introduce them as I go. And I propose to ask you all, if you're listening, a similar question so we hear your general overview rather quickly, and then I'll drill down a little and we'll have more of a discussion. So the common question I would like to ask all of you is, what is the key yield that you and your business have experienced from this international education sector that you think may not have been fully grasped in the wider community? And I'm first going to welcome Gillian Costa, who's from the Republic of Geelong, as one of my friends said recently. We're sitting here in the Republic of Geelong. Gillian's had 30 years managing private business, and she's very involved in the Geelong community. For the past 4 years, she's been a member of the MACS, the Multicultural Aged Care Services Board, a not-for-profit organisation, and that helps the elderly people to live their lives to the fullest. So I'm just wondering how you see it from the Geelong community, Gillian. How would you say that do you experience the benefits of international education?
Yes, Geraldine, we really do, significantly in our business. And I'll leave, it's interesting you raise MACS. That's actually the Multicultural Aged Care Hostel. So if you want me to start talking about internationals there, I'd need a longer time slot really. But for our hospitality business, and we are situated in close proximity to Deakin, the international students have quite a big impact, and currently we have none. And we've just launched our new menu, and I've got no translators. So it's small things like that that you wouldn't actually consider that these students really benefit to us. So there's, just to put it in a nutshell, there's trade. We do get trade from them, their families, certainly. They're great employees because they fill a gap in time where the locals aren't as available, and plus we need the numbers. They're there often for 4 years for the duration of their degree, and they go from being a pair of hands essentially to being supervisors and sometimes, you know, lead team members, and very influential. So we actually benefit from the degrees they're doing as well, because as they progress through their degree and through our training, they actually contribute more and more depending on the skills that they're picking up at school as well as at work. But the biggest thing for me is the diversity. And I can't sort of speak enough about the value of that in our team. And whilst they may not necessarily be coming up with great ideas, their experiences and their different way of viewing day-to-day things and whatever we might be working on at the time really expands our thinking. So having that mix in our team for me is quite valuable. I think it makes us a stronger organisation for having that diversity. But, you know, then there's a flow-on effect from Deakin, who are also a big customer of us. So we want them to thrive as well. So if they need students, so do we.
Okay, thanks, Gillian. And I'll come back to aspects of that. Now, Bob Hawes is from the Hunter Business Chamber. He started there as CEO 3 years ago, and he's had a lot of experience in regional development, particularly in strategic and infrastructure planning and economic impact assessment. And he moved to the Hunter in the 1980s. And of course, once they moved to the Hunter, they never, ever leave. He's a proud Novocastrian. You've got to say that. I'm sure you are, but it's in Newcastle that you do say that. Now, I just wonder, I've had a lot to do with the Newcastle University, with the Family Action Centre there. I've been patron for many years. So I do know a little bit about the impact, well, the sense that they're embedded in the community, but particularly the international education aspect of it, Bob. How would you experience it?
Well, thanks, Geraldine. Yes, look, it's a real situation in a region like the Hunter of challenge and opportunity. You know, we're too far from Sydney, but close enough in some respects. You know, 2 hours drive, we've really got to survive or make sure we can do it on our own, as opposed to an area that might be within an hour's drive or less, where that umbilical cord, if you like, is still quite large. So the things we have to do here have to be very generic and very organic. We have to think laterally to make the value out of the international student cohort that we do get here through, obviously, through the University of Newcastle. And as I said, the challenges are around to making the best of that, because those things around a lack of natural cultural diversity, you know, the ethnic makeup of regions like the Hunter is nothing like you get in capital cities. You know, we've got around 85% of our population up here are Australian born. And cultural and language diversity that is not there either. But the opportunity is fantastic, because really the Hunter region is an emerging global gateway in terms of its activity that goes through the port, through the airport, and some of our research institutions is quite phenomenal. And if we're to make the most of that, we need the full vertical to be able to do that. And what the international students bring to us is the capacity to do that. But as I said, there are still challenges around that to make sure we do capture it and make the most of it. And, you know, organisations like ours, where we're trying to integrate businesses more in a better way than what they have done in the past to do that, is a slow process. But we're getting.
Is there resistance?
I wouldn't say resistance. I think, going back to your point about you saying the lack of awareness in the community, often it is just an awareness issue. The resistance can be just like anything, anyone not liking change. But obviously businesses up here that have done it and persist with it, it's a bit about persistence, have got some benefits.
Sally, I was just going to ask another question of Bob, but I'll thanks Bob, and I'll come to Sally, who is the Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Must be a fun thing to be at the moment, Sally. Lots of challenges there. The first woman to be directly elected, and she chairs the major projects portfolio and the major events portfolio. And Sally's had a lot of roles in consultancy roles and so on, and took the small business that she founded to the ASX. So what I'm really trying to sketch is you've got a really lovely tapestry, I think, of observing these sorts of things. Now, Melbourne in particular, I must say, I was stunned by the statistics when I was briefed on this about the importance of international students to the city of Melbourne. Have you had to learn about that yourself?
Well, actually, Geraldine, and hello, everybody. Lovely to be part of this today. And we are dedicated to international students because of their importance to virtually every aspect of our city. And really, since I was involved with an organisation called the Committee for Melbourne, 12, 13 years ago now, was my first introduction to understanding how important international students are to our economy and community. And the reason I became aware of it then is because we did a report at the Committee for Melbourne into our higher education sector, the importance of it in its totality, but what was revealed was absolutely how the international student market plays a pivotal role, not just in the education sector itself, but across our broader economy, over $5 billion in economic value to Victoria. And certainly here in the city of Melbourne, we know that we've got almost 80,000 international students that form part of our economy and community. And when I say that, it's really important because so many amazing stories have come out during COVID of international students who are actually helping on the front line, either through their studies or through their part-time jobs. International students who, despite their own devastating circumstances in many ways, are volunteering and helping others through community groups. International students who come with a sense of pride into our community, and due to COVID, not only is their study interrupted, but often their jobs have also been interrupted, and now they are living, hand to mouth, and it just can't be for such an important cohort within our city population. And that's why we've responded very quickly to what we see as an unfair situation for our international students by providing programs. Importantly, our biggest one was an investment with the state government in a food voucher program. We had queues for more than 1 kilometre of people waiting just to be able to access some support for purchasing food. And that's not a situation we want. And for us at the city, it doesn't reflect how we should be supporting people who are so important to us across various sectors.
But why was this not recognised before? I mean, this is the crucial thing we're trying to get at. I mean, they're huge numbers. What did people think they were, if you know what I mean? Was it a...
Yeah. I think really what's important about this discussion, and so much of what the experience has been, is to recognise the status of international students to our broader economy and community. They've been, they have slipped through the cracks because they're often not eligible for JobKeeper, they're often not eligible for JobSeeker. They are always, I've had, unfortunately people say to me, oh, well, their families should be looking after them. We are their family. We are the community in which they are making a contribution. We should be looking after these students. And as you say, Geraldine, it's not just during a crisis, but it's all the time. I think we really need to recognise their status, they're important to us, and make sure that they are recognised accordingly. I've been doing virtual citizenship ceremonies during the lockdown. We actually kicked it off as the first municipality working with the federal department to make that happen, because so many people are sitting there, I'm not just saying international students, but more broadly, that are just desperate to get some sort of status so that they are officially recognised and supported appropriately. And I think that's what we should continue to strive towards. I'll give you just another juxtaposition. Back when I was at the Committee for Melbourne, the key thing that we were fighting for was the chance for international students even to be eligible for student concession fares on our public transport system. Fast forward to a pandemic and a crisis, and we find that we need to appropriately recognise the status of our international students to make sure that they are supported, recognised and supported at times of crisis like this. And that gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about.
It certainly does, and I'm going to come back to that. But I want to welcome Stephen Ferguson now, who's CEO of the Australian Hotels Association, which is a very powerful voice of Australia's hotel industry. And he serves really in this role as the corporate link, I suppose you could say, between Australia's 5,000 hotels and the federal government. And he's well used to this business of trying to negotiate complexity between diverse groups of stakeholders. So I'm very much looking forward, Stephen, to how you think about this.
Geraldine, I think the government and the opposition now, a really pleasing report came out last week dealing with working holiday makers, which are backpackers now. They're a distinct group from international students. But amongst our workforce, we will have Australians who everyone tries to give jobs to first. Then there's lots of gaps in the market, and that might be because of geography or because of skills. And international students fall into that with sort of other skilled workers and, as I say, backpackers. And really this report from the committee last time was the first time that I saw both sides of government and the sort of in-betweeners really start to recognise in writing the benefits of international students and other types of working holiday makers. And they've gone so far to now recommend that international students be granted further extensions to visas that they can get if they go to what they call peri-urban, regional and remote areas. And that's probably where we have a lot of our struggles is in the remote areas. I was talking to a fellow who's 100 kilometres the other side of Gundawindi a month ago. He has, in a town of 200 people, they've got full employment. The farms are firing, lots of grain have been grown. You can't get anyone to work at his pub. And he actually relies on people like international students to come out there. Mm. His observation was that these kids, and he said, especially even with the postgraduate, young international students who have completed a degree, are really happy to go to what others might describe as the back end of nowhere because they find it romantic. Mm. It's exciting and it's an adventure. But a kid from Australia who, say, lives in the city, he's now got his business degree, his first thought is not to move 500 kilometres west of Brisbane. Doesn't have appeal for him. But international students are ones who are happy to say, well, I'll go to Early Beach, I'll go to Gundawindi, I'll go to Hell Western Crooked and get out there. And I think that's where you find the most welcoming people in those communities. When you go into those bush areas, they're the ones that are most appreciative of the diversity and sort of internationalisation of those little regions. Most often the GP is a migrant to Australia. And so they sort of really managed to break down any sort of, how do you say, cultural opposition or whatever out there that you might find exists anywhere. So, look, in brief, I think that the tide's turning, that governments are starting to recognise the value of international students. And I think it's, nowhere better felt than in the regions.
And do you don't get, would you say you get pushback anywhere? Like as this is starting to move, I think, into a different realm, do you get pushback? Do you people say, no, that's not your business?
Well, I think what Sally Capp talked about, you do get pushback. I mean, they were left out of all the sort of JobKeeper, JobSeeker, all the other types of job maker schemes. But if we did not have these international students, and Gillian will tell you this, we wouldn't have people to do the work. So, I think the message is finally starting to get through. Right. They bring more money with them than they take home. They spend it here and their families come over. It's fantastic.
Hmm. Okay, well now finally I'd love to bring in Megan Lilly, who's embedded deeply and passionately in Australia's manufacturing sector. She's been head of workforce development at the AI Group since 2015, and she has also been very involved with the newly formed Workforce Development Division of AI Group, which there's lots happening in Australian manufacturing, thankfully, and maybe this COVID has kickstarted quite a lot of it. She's also chair of Manufacturing Skills Australia, a member of the Australian College of Education, and sort of on a wide number of committees about this. So now, I wouldn't have thought, to be perfectly honest, Megan, that manufacturing would have been an area that would be called on to make a comment here. So explain how you encounter this, please.
Well, I think I'll speak more broadly than manufacturing. So Australian industry groups, members of companies, and we have companies across the economy are our members. So it's not just a manufacturing conversation. And in our economic work, we do the performance of manufacturing index, the performance of construction index, the performance of services index, and the aggregate business index. So that gives a really broad base to make comments about the impact on business. So manufacturing is obviously a critical area, but it's not limited. My comments aren't limited to manufacturing.
Okay, so in this broader realm that you're describing, these are keenly felt observations about the role of international education, is it?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think Sally's comments, actually particularly hearing the 80,000 people in Melbourne, and I'm a Melburnian as well, so, you know, it is what it is at the moment, but 80,000 international students in Melbourne at a normal period of time, whatever that is really quite a figure that I actually think a lot of people would be quite surprised by that. So I think that, you know, to go to your question about, you know, what's the key yield, not fully grasped by the wider community, I'm going to interpret the wider community as the community in the economy and the business community as well. And I think the first thing that's not fully appreciated is the volume of international students. But it is understood, I think, that how they contribute, particularly, say, to hospitality and retail and those sorts of areas, is sort of a much more obvious labour link, their labour market link, in normal times, obviously not at the moment. But I think that there's actually very significant spillover benefits that you would also get from not only the international students, but their visitors that you referred to that come across annually. I think, sorry, the Federal Minister referred to. And so there's a lot of economic spillover benefits. And so if you're in a period like we are now, then you actually get depressed demand as a result of it. It flows back the other way. So if you're not serving as much food, your food manufacturers are not preparing as much food, and they're not packaging as much food, and they're not transporting as much food. And that might come from the regions or the specialists or niche manufacturers all around the place. So that is sort of really the spillover benefit that cascades one way or the other. And in good times, it's fantastic. And in times like we're in at the moment, if international education isn't just a problem about not having enough international students, it actually impacts more broadly. And I think, so that's the silent story that's not understood. So there's a cultural story, but there's an economic story as well.
And do you, even in this rather dramatic times, to the best of your knowledge, are people identifying that economic story? Are they noting, for instance, that there's a drop-off? It may not be possible to assess that at the moment in Victoria, but I'm just wondering whether it's starting to quietly percolate through people's senses, you know, that it does matter.
Well, I think that will start to be felt. So there are some measurements around the obvious areas, such as where you've got casual employment in you know, hospitality, accommodation, retail, that sorts of stuff. But we're talking beyond that, and I think that will take a while to actually sort of. It's hard to get a measure on it, but it takes a while for it to trickle through. But I also just sort of also make the point that there's also the issue about when international students graduate and they're allowed to stay on and work for a couple of years. That's a very specialist, high skill contribution to our economy. So we shouldn't lose sight of that, particularly around technology universities. So there is a strong link there with manufacturing. But the other thing is that I think this is exposed, and I need to say this a bit delicately, but I think we've had a bit of a cash cow mentality with international education. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to think about a better and more sustainable relationship that's reciprocated.
Okay, fascinating. Well, I'm going to take that up. Now, look, all right, well, look, thank you all for those remarks. I want to go back to Sally Capp's very interesting remarks about we are their family, Sally. Now, again, to put words to things that might be going through communities' minds, maybe there's quite a few in the community saying, well, I didn't really think we would become a sort of welfare arm for the international community, you know, or when was I consulted about the idea? Is that sort of massive foreign aid? I'm accepting. I know that these are people who paid big fees and so on and so forth. But at a time of crisis, you're describing, you know, a really different, seems to me, relationship that you realise has had to come through. Now, I just wonder whether you think that this is something that, whether you think that approach is changing, or whether there's ambivalence about playing that sort of a role?
Well, look, I hope as a result of the crisis that we do see some positive change on our approach, our attitudes, the way in which we integrate and support international students. I think everybody on the panel today has really spoken to the value that they bring. And we don't look at it just as value today either. It's about value for the future. These are relationships that we're setting up. And I know from my time working with the state government in trade and investment that a number of the successes that we celebrated came from foreign investors saying, well, I studied there. I know that market, I feel good about that market, and I want to participate in that market going forward. I also know of lots of stories as my time as Lord Mayor of many opportunities, I call them bridges, that we've been able to build for Victorian people, Melbourne companies, as they want to leap into overseas markets, where we're able to tap on the shoulder of former international students and ask for those introductions and that support into markets overseas. So I feel, and I think my comments reflect the fact that if we keep thinking narrowly about international students, their value and the way that they participate in our economy and community, then we will only ever get narrow outcomes as a result. And that will be that they, as they do, underwrite our tertiary education system in Australia, but it is so much more than that. And if we don't start leveraging that relationship, the outcomes and the way in which they contribute more, recognising it and supporting it, then I think we're really going to miss the boat, because every other economy around the world is competing for this market. They want people to come into their country to study, recognising the value that they bring. Today, for the City of Melbourne, every dollar spent by an international student on education is worth more than an extra $1.15 in our local economy. And that's just the start in terms of the value that they drive.
And incidentally, if any of our guests just sort of wave at me, and I'll do feel free to make it as, keep it down to vaguely civilised. Yes, okay, Gillian, do.
Look, it was an interesting comment of Sally calling the internationals our family, but if I can talk from a very, very real, very small perspective, we have a Canadian girl, and she's not eligible for JobKeeper or job seeker, and she can't go home. She's here. She's part of our team, as much a valued member of our team as everyone else. Everybody else is getting some support. We shut down in March significantly. There was no work. So what do? You're severely cutting your costs because we want to try and survive this. Here's this girl with no other help. So we've had to keep her on. And I'm really pleased that the rest of the team have embraced that. We've had a few actually that haven't, we've got an Indian as well, who haven't actually qualified for the JobKeeper. And we've been able to keep them on enough to keep them going. Everybody's dropped hours, so everyone's surviving on enough, and everyone's embraced the fact that we're keeping them on as well, because they really are part of our family. And as we're now reopening in Geelong, thankfully, starting to reopen, these guys are working really hard. They're very loyal, and I'm really glad that we've gone the distance with them, because we're going to get that back from them. But it's great to have them as part of the team. And I think from, everyone talks about the environment and how tough it is and everything. The whole team being able to carry all the families.
Yes, that does say something. I agree. But I'm sort of quite intrigued as to why there wasn't a more obvious sense of this.
There really needed to be, because these guys, from our point of view, are the same as everybody, yet I feel like as a country we've shunned them.
We've discriminated against them. We have, Gillian.
Yeah, very much so. And they should have qualified the same as the others. The rules were, you had to be employed by this date and have worked so long and whatever it was, where they qualified for that, I really would have liked to have seen them come through. The whole JobKeeper thing is like a stimulus package. They're spending here as well. I think, these guys can't pay a rent and they've got nothing to buy food with. That's that's not right, because they don't have a biological family to fall back on like the others do. So they actually need it in a lot of cases more. And
well,
I think it's a big error not to look after them.
The public statements were at the start, certainly from the Prime Minister down, well, look, it's your job to now go home, that Australia can't really support you. Now, in fact, it's quite interesting. The ATN supplied me with a list of responses from overseas, and the Canadians also said go home, but they did offer support as well. The Canadians are really, and the UK and the US are our big competitors, you're quite right. So there was a subtly different approach. I'm just wondering, Stephen, you know, you're used to reading the politics of this a bit in your various iterations of jobs. I mean, what do you put this down to? Well, I mean, to be honest, it seemed to me almost like animosity for a while to national students at the start.
Really interesting question, Geraldine. I think that there is no doubt there is a lot of dog whistling that goes on in the community around whether the international students, working holiday makers, skilled workers. So we do have to battle that. But early on in this whole debate, we actually were one of the first organisations to come out and suggest something like JobKeeper. But we fought very hard early which only covered about 50% of the workforce that lost their jobs in the hospitality sector. So accommodation and food services, so pubs, restaurants, clubs, cafes, employed 900,000 people. Only half of them were eligible for JobKeeper. And the ones that missed out were the short-term casuals, international students, skilled workers and others. And we had hotel groups providing free meals because they still had their kitchens going to provide takeaway meals, and basically having provided like a St Vincent de Paul service to these people. So, but why was it? I think that I think there's two issues. One is there's a reluctance in the community around visas. So a lot of people think that people are stealing Australian jobs. They're not. These kids are taking jobs that Australians don't want to do. Now, why that is, kids don't want to do that, I don't know. But I think it was budgetary. I think it was really in all their conversations with the Treasury, it was all around money. And we were saying, well, we're 600 billion in debt. We're going to be 800 billion in debt. Does it matter if we're 810 billion in debt? You know, it's not going to take a lot of money. And then my frustration with it is that we go out to the world at large and we say to the parents of these children, we're a safe country to send your children. We'll look after them whilst they're here. We have a great set of values. Our values are, friendship, mateship, looking after people who who need a hand up. And then the first tickle of sort of, things are a bit tough. We say, all bets off. You've got to go home. I mean, that doesn't stack up. If we looked after those people properly, they would have been the best ambassadors we could ever have. But we didn't. We did the wrong thing by them. But anyway,
that's what we're trying to work through. I mean, Megan, your thoughts were quite challenging, that you think in a way, it's hard to put words to, but there has been a bit of a cash cow mentality. And there have been rivers of gold flowing from these people. Do you think that's somehow gone awry? It's led into, would you say, as a callousness? Is that a word you'd use towards this sector?
No, I think that's probably a bit harsh, and I wouldn't want to be quoted using that language. So put that out there first. But I mean, there's no doubt that the economic contribution to international education has been very significant to the entire Australian economy, but most especially the Victorian economy. But my point really is really how you balance that out. So with reciprocal relationships. So it isn't just about us getting, I just don't like any relationship that's viewed with a one-way lens. I don't think it's healthy. And just to pick up on Sally's earlier point, she's talking about this is not also an opportunity to think forward or to think about tomorrow. And so I think the think forward is a really important point. So I think a lot of us have always understood the soft diplomacy value of international students, and I think it's more important as ever to not lose sight of that, because as Stephen did say, they can be our greatest ambassadors going forward if we get this right, or maybe we've missed that boat, but let's see. But it's not just about soft diplomacy in that form. I mean, the economy and despite the difficulties of the pandemic and the moment, the world, we live in a global market. There's global and international supply chains. Technology underpins all manner of these things. So we as a country will continue, or will emerge from this and continue to have relationships, economic and supply relationships all around the world. And our international students will be part of those supply chains, so we can have really good, healthy reciprocal relationships. So I think this isn't just about the now, although the now is crucial and critical, and it isn't just about the casual work they do, although I'm not for a minute diminishing that. But I think that there's a bigger forward agenda that we can also think about. And I think, hopefully we could recalibrate some of this so we bring some of these other elements into how we go forward with it all.
Bob Hawes, what do you, from the Hunter region, is that sort of conversation underway at all, do you think, or not?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly, there's a couple of points there about the stickiness of the international students you do get here. Early on in the piece, University of Newcastle, was sort of doing a thing with all comers, and most of that we were getting from the traditional markets, USA, parts of Europe. But they found those kids were anxious to get home as soon as their degree finished, notwithstanding the provision that they had, they could stay here. So they figured out now the nationalities do are a bit more sticky, that can provide that added value, and that'd be India, Pakistan, some of the Asian nations, and that's working really well, notwithstanding the need to build in those support structures to make sure they're comfortable when they get here. And that ambassadorial role works in spades. I mean, those ethnic groups are very much linked and influenced by what their peers say, what their families say, and that influence is tremendous. I mean, we've got a minute example here, even though the Jack Ma, the Alibaba CEO, managing director, he wasn't a student here, but he struck up a relationship with people here in Newcastle, and that's ended up in a $20 million fund that he's given to the University of Newcastle in the interests of international students that are coming here to further their study. So it really is that if you'll get it back in spades. You just got to find where that niche is. And as I said earlier, in regional markets, it's not just a mass market proposition as it is in the capital cities, because capital cities speak for themselves. Everyone knows about Sydney, everyone knows Brisbane, everyone knows Melbourne, but not everyone knows where Newcastle or Geelong or some of these secondary areas are, and what's the value proposition to them. No good saying to them, "Oh, just come here, there'll be a wonderful lifestyle on a nice beach." They want to know that employment and the other things that they're going to be, the welfare package, I suppose, if you want to call it that, as well as that jobs or that life package that goes with it when they're here at the university, has been thought about.
How much, though, do you think the economics here and now, economic impact, is likely to shift sets of attitudes in the decision makers than talking about this longer term growth that you're all talking about? It's sort of like it's a longer investment, but I'm just wondering about the here and now. Do you think that whole lever could be pulled better and articulated better?
Well, I think from the regional point of view, absolutely, but it's not easy. So those support structures that people just assume are around in capital cities, not always the case, because some of the hardship stories we just heard, that was up here in the region as well. University of Newcastle ended up doing appealing to the community to come forward with food and services packages and vouchers and things to offer to the international students that weren't otherwise getting. Yes, absolutely. It went pretty well. It could have gone better, but it was a very short startup, very, very short run up to it. But it's part of that they would then value, and I think people remember that. But longer term, we're mad if we don't work at the way of trying to grab hold of the positives that we've got left at the moment. And it's been tough, very, very tough for all the universities around the country. And for the students themselves. So, we've got to find out where those positives are and try and work on them and rebuild, because as I think Megan or Sally who said that, we're in an international market. It's not just about what that link we have between us and them. We're competing with other countries around the world.
Mm. And Gillian, Alison, that's what I'm trying to say. What about, I'm trying to say Sally, come back to me. Lord, Sally, you're the one that seems to me has got this big cohort that you can really, I mean, it's just an incredible sort of tool to almost mount the argument that this is an area that is a job creator. Part of that reciprocal relationship. I really like the way Megan's characterised that. Now, how are you going to mount that argument better? Because clearly, if you don't mind me saying it, it hasn't been mounted well.
No, it hasn't. I mean, all of us are saying exactly the same thing. And COVID has created a time of disconnect, and we need to use it to reset on certain things. And we've identified international students and their status as something. This has to be a platform that changes going forward in a positive way for international students and all of us, because they're so intertwined in every aspect of our city life. So to think that there is a group that you can sort of separate and put off to one side just doesn't work. So Geraldine, I think it's really a call to action, isn't it? And what's occurred to me as part of this panel is we've been talking to the state government and doing some joint advocacy into federal government. Actually, what we should be doing is really broadening that out to make sure that everybody that has a view on this and can bring some perspective to help with those discussions, particularly with federal government, because ultimately that's where a lot of this sits. And it does also sit with community. We need to get more of these voices out to help people across our community understand why international students are, why this is their home while they're here, frankly. And doing more of that together, I think, might give us a louder voice and a broader platform from which to really strive to get some change. And I can't overstate it. To go to some of the points said earlier, and here's the story. I was talking to one of our well-known cafe owners here in Melbourne the other day. His voice caught with emotion and he had to hold himself back. And when he'd gathered himself again, he said, I'm so sorry. He said, what's happened to me is, of my 32 staff at a cafe where we welcome a lot of tourists, of the 32, 28 are international students that bring their culture, their language, their understanding of what our customers are looking for and experience, have been absolutely pivotal to my success and I think to Melbourne's success. 28 of them I have been trying to feed every week and to make sure that their rent is paid, because they have no other way of supporting themselves at the moment. And, you know, if you just extrapolate that story out over and again of the hardship that's happening at every level and understanding the value that they drive for us at that micro level all the way through to macro level, we have to keep thinking of those stories and talking about them, because that is the human element of this in both sides of it, and that's what we need to change. That should not happen in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia.
Now, well, the value proposition, you know, to use the jargon, it just, I suppose that seems to me to be the challenge, Stephen, to articulate differently the value proposition to communities around the place of international students. Now, well, I think it's a slightly different conversation to the one we've been having by and large.
I think they're just good stories that need to be told. As Sally was saying, they're just great examples of taking and this is a long, slow burn thing. You know, it's got to be done, say, you know, dare I say it, through a great program from the ABC, which tells stories well. And taking a kid and saying, okay, here's so-and-so from whichever country, and they've had to pay, you know, $10,000 or $20,000 or $40,000 for a degree in 1 year. So here's their contribution on one side. Their mum and dad have come out. They've got a part-time job working in Gillian's pub, you know, serving meals. You know, the balance is just incredible. And that's before you get to the sort of to the relationship side. But because we should, I think, I really sort of hate to talk about this, but we've really got to get Australians to stop talking about this people are stealing Australian jobs, and I think it's a massive barrier. These kids bring so much to us financially.
Well, in fact, we're going to talk about that
Yeah.
in the next hour. Because in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that they actually promote Australian jobs. But that hasn't been the discussion. Look, I'm just sort of going to ask you all, because it just seems to me that, some of these stories are heartrending that you're telling, these Sally stories. But I suppose in a way, what the question is can the discussion be changed to consider what's in it for the Australian community? It's this reciprocal relationship that Megan's describing. And maybe, Gillian, I'll just ask you all that question. Do you think that you may not agree, by the way, you're entitled not to, but is there a sort of a subtly different tone of the conversation that you think would move this discussion along to a different level?
Yeah, look, I'm sure there would, and you could tell that story on a lot of different levels as well. Because from my point of view, as a parent, the relationship that are formed when you work side by side for a couple of years. If I've got children travelling overseas, I love the idea that they have homes, if you like, family, that they can check in with along the way, that there's someone over there that we can reach out to in a moment of trouble or something. And vice versa, when these kids are coming to Australia, it would be lovely for us to have that support mechanism and have those teams built so their family know that they're in, be it Newcastle or Geelong regional places as well, that, stuff can happen anywhere, but there's actually a good lifestyle for them and reasonably safe. So we can pitch stories on really anywhere and find good supporting evidence, because there's so much positivity in having, as I said, the diversity here. I mean, we're saying they're pinching our jobs. What are we? I come from a history of Italian and Irish migrants. So who am I to say, like some of our staff now have bred Australian babies, and one just put it recently, like, I made an Australian baby, and it's exciting, and for all intents and purposes they're now Australian. This mother is now Australian. So I think it's probably a very short sort of lens to say that they're stealing our jobs or that they are not part of us. I think once you come in here and you take a job and you start working, you become Australian.
Okay, so
you're not also where you've come from, but you become part of the Australian landscape. We've been built on that sort of diversity.
Yes, and so it's very much for you an Australian values issue.
I think so, and we could argue all day about JobKeeper. Why are my casuals who used to earn $300 a week now getting $750? I don't think we had to increase the budget to be able to allow a stimulus package to cover everybody. And I'm not criticising the government, by the way. It happened in a real hurry, and I applaud them for getting it out there. It's kept us all alive, or a lot of us. So it's not a criticism, but in hindsight and going forward, there is a better way we could have done that. Okay.
And Megan, how would you shift the argument around this, the debate?
Well, I'm probably going to give a bit of perhaps a short answer, because I actually think the way you framed the question, and we actually already shifted it, because you said, what can we do to be changed to start us thinking about what's in it for the Australian community? Whereas I think previously the question was more about the benefit for the Australian economy. And just using the word community instead of economy, I think you've actually started the reframing process.
Okay, good. Well, I hope. I'm still quietly trying to think about it. And Stephen, how would you shift the debate?
Oh, look, I just think what Megan said there made absolute sense. I mean, we sort of talk about, I think, the universities, we know the revenue losses in the universities are massive, but sort of shifting the debate from not talking about whether universities lose money, which, most people would not have high on their agenda of things that they worry about, unlike the people that work in universities. But it's shifting to this whole community angle, that these people are, we send them our kids, they send us theirs. We should be looking after each other, which I think was Sally's point. So frame it away from the dollars and bring it back to culture and community.
Very interesting. And Bob, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that in Australia, we're not very good about understanding how to make, we talk about making the pie bigger instead of cutting it up differently or making the circle bigger. And that's what we've got to do. We're very traditional in the way that we look at some of these things, and that whole possessiveness around change and not wanting to go with it, and the job stealing bit. It really is amazing how when you dig into some of those things that really are letting facts, or not letting the facts get in the way of a good story, as it were. And certainly up here in our economy, we've got quite a diverse industrial and business base. And there's ample opportunities right across some of those areas that Stephen mentioned, particularly where we're just opportunities that Australians aren't good at taking up or sticking with. So, yeah, make that community circle bigger is what this message we've got to sell.
Good. I like these little mantras, little slogans. And finally, to you, Sally, you've said a lot already, but I'm really exercised by the sort of predicament that you describe in Melbourne, I must say.
Yes, and look, this is a national thing, but for Melbourne, it's been a strength of ours, and it needs to be a strength again. Having represented Victoria overseas, I am very aware of the fact that as major economies around the world, we've got one of the smallest national populations on one of the biggest land masses. Our history, our present and our future is very dependent on how we open ourselves to global markets and to immigration. Otherwise, we are on a circle to ordinariness, which has got to be one of the worst things imaginable. But we become irrelevant, we become isolated, and frankly, we do turn into a circle of nothingness. So international students are absolutely...
What do you really mean?
International students are a key to that, and we've had it almost without planning for it or being strategic about it. And now is a time absolutely to become far more thoughtful, deliberate and proactive on how we make sure that we have international students playing a major role in our economy and community into the future. It's vital.
Yes, well look, we're all in more or less furious agreement. It's very interesting indeed to hear you all sort of do that lovely juggling act between the money, you might say, and the values. I think that's lovely, actually. I find that very emboldening as an Australian. So look, thank you very much indeed. Gillian, Costa, Bob Hawes, Sally Capp, Stephen Ferguson and Megan Lilly. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Geraldine.
Thank you. Great to be involved.
Thank you.
Set up for our session 2, which is coming in just a moment.
Well done, Geraldine.
Thank you.
Thanks, Geraldine.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you. Nice to sort of meet you all, and goodbye.
Good luck, Gillian.
Bye-bye. See you.
My name is Kelly. I went to Adelaide High School and came to the University of South Australia to study the Bachelor of Nursing. I remember when I was in year 11 and 12, I went to open day 2 years in a row just to feel what it's like to be in the university environment.
The feedback that we get about international students going into University of South Australia is that there's a lot of learning support for them. They also have excellent facilities at the university.
I'm Visnan, and I went to Hunley High School Adelaide, and currently I'm doing Bachelor of Commerce in the University of South Australia. When I was in year 12, my high school gave us a lot of information about the University of South Australia. I really enjoy the studying environment because all the facilities are great, and also we got some very great project room that we can book for group study.
quality of the teaching staff at the University of South Australia was excellent. I really appreciate their passion and also the patience as well. During class, they actually share us their own experience working as a nurse, and that helped a lot to reinforce my chosen career. The teaching actually prepared me really well to enter the workforce.
And I think it's quite easy to find a part-time job in Adelaide, and it's very flexible to fit my university study.
We have a steady stream of international kids who keep in touch with us, let us know what they're doing, and want to tell us about how good they feel about the University of South Australia.
Well, welcome back to session 2, and that was our last session was to look at the innards of job creation in individual regions, and now we're going to have a slightly broader thought about whether international education does drive broader economic growth in a way, again, in a way that we haven't really put words to. And we've got 4 marvellous guests, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to ask each of them for a sort of an establishing question to get their sort of top of mind views, and then I'll try to drill down a bit. And the question, which I haven't warned them of, so it's not hard, what would you emphasise individually if asked to consider international education's contribution, not merely to educating, but to economic growth? I mean, how would you cast that answer? And I think it'll be very interesting to hear what you all say. Our first guest for this session is the Honourable Ted Baillieu, who was the Premier of Victoria from 2010 to 2013, an architect by training, and he's been well versed as he was in opposition to a range of different portfolios, and then of course in government. So I know that Ted Baillieu does think very broadly about these things. So Ted Baillieu, how would you answer that about economic growth in the broader sense? Is it worthwhile asking a question like this?
It absolutely is, Geraldine, and thank you for the opportunity. And I would describe it, you didn't share the question with us, so I would describe it, international education is the international tapestry we all have to have. And every thread of connection is a thread which enriches, and every thread is one that creates additional opportunities, trade, security, human, social. International education is right at the centre of it. And I would, it's only in February, late February, I was on the trade mission with Simon Birmingham, we listened to earlier. And there we were in Delhi and Mumbai promoting international education and a better link with tourism. And I was very, very proud to be able to do that. And we came home and we've been locked down in Melbourne virtually ever since. So yes, it's been not trading, but devastating for the international education industry. And I have 3 points I've made. I've got some slides if we want to look at them.
Oh,
we can do
right.
That. But 3 points I'd make is there is a growing need for international education. But secondly, the world is a very different place. And thirdly, we have to take a radically different approach. And there's nothing I heard in the previous session that I would disagree with. I think it's important. I don't know whether you want to have a quick look at some slides now. Or
I'll come back to those if I could, Ted, because I just want to get everybody's views, but I think that's very interesting. John Hart's with us too. He's steeped in the hospitality industry again. He's currently the Executive Chair for the Australian Chamber for Tourism and the Executive Director of the Restaurant and Catering Industry Association of Australia, which is the peak national body representing the interests of restaurants, cafes and caterers in Australia. So John, how would you answer that question about economics part of it rather than so much the education part of it?
Yeah, thanks, Geraldine. Well, I'd start out with the headline stat, which is that migration adds about 7 percentage points to GDP nationally. So the sort of business case starts there, that any activity that brings people into our country adds significant amounts to GDP. And in fact, if we turn that around, as we have managed to do during the COVID period, and turned off that tap, in fact, we lose more than 7 percentage points in GDP. And the reason is because of the flow-through expenditure. And as Ted rightly put, I was over there in that joint session that we did on international education and tourism in Mumbai at the end of the India trip, and we only just managed to get back before COVID set in. At that forum, we were talking about the $77 billion that the two industries, our two service sectors, adds to our economy. That's a huge amount of money. And those two areas of the economy are inextricably linked. You can't have a thriving tourism industry to the extent we do without having international education interwoven into that. And
are you sure? Are you sure of that? Because I mean, people might say, "Oh, you know, he's pulling our leg a bit."
Well, it's absolutely proof positive. If you look at the amount of family and friends that come over to visit international students when they're in country, if you look at the amount of spend within the tourism sector that accounts for, you're looking at about 12 percentage points in overall tourism spend. And that is simply because they stay for a long period of time, they spend a lot of money, and there's truckloads of them. So, you know, that is it's a very significant part of the amount of money that we get through the tourism spend, let alone the students themselves, counting in our short-term arrivals, and therefore, if they are staying less than a year, they themselves account for a part of tourism because they are treated as visitors. So there is a very, very deep linkage between the two sectors, and if those two sectors at about 80% of our overall services exports, if the tap was to be turned off as it has been now, although still we are getting some students still continuing their studies, but if you turn the tap off entirely, you'd have somewhere in the order of 10 to 11% of GDP coming out of the market, and that's pretty extraordinary.
No, and come back to that. Kim Curtin's with us too. Kim's from the world of finance and commerce, and she's done a lot of work with New South Wales Treasury, and she's done a lot of work in trade and investment strategy, both offshore and onshore capability as well. So she's a bureaucrat who thinks about these things. And sometimes you've got to persuade Treasury. Treasury's a bit of a problem in some of these discussions, Kim. I think that's the perception anyway. Is it something that the Treasuries are alert to, the amount of money that is churned around by international education, or not?
Absolutely. And it's thanks for having me. It's great to be part of the discussion. So I mean, treasuries generally have the economics sort of function often as part of the Treasury, and so our economists absolutely are clear on, as John was saying, the enormous benefit that, from a financial perspective, that international students bring. But it is an interesting time in New South Wales Treasury with the actual delivery of international students, and tourism has been brought into Treasury as well. So we're having to see both sides of the coin as well as the funding side, but actually how do we deliver this and maximise the benefit? So
what do you mean there? What do you mean there about both sides?
So in terms of, so the team that I lead in Treasury is not the traditional budget part of Treasury, I guess we're the spending side, I guess. So we have a role, we lead for government on Study New South Wales, on the Destination New South Wales, which is our tourism agency, a part of the Treasury cluster. And we're not just looking and analysing what the benefits might be, but actually getting out there and trying to maximise those benefits by delivering.
I see. So you're actually right now, you're embedded in understanding the weeds of this and what generates money.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's great. So on your question right at the start, And I absolutely agree with the comments already made, and the economic addition is huge. And I love the comment about international tapestry, which I absolutely get. I think that's a great way of presenting it.
Economists don't normally talk like that.
I'm not an economist, so I work with economists.
You work with economists.
But I mean, just from New South Wales's perspective, in 1819, it's sort of the analysis was that international education generated over $13 billion of export income for the state. And so, but I think it's more than just that. I think the addition of what that funding actually also contributes to from a research perspective, and also just, I mean, we are a multicultural society, and this was, I think, brought out beautifully in the previous session. And the importance of diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds to contribute to our research. There's a lot of international students who also go on to start startups in New South Wales, as well as the other jobs that they contribute to, as well as the tourism angle, as John was talking about. And beyond their actual education while they're here, they also develop great links with Australia, which carry on for many years. They become some of our greatest advocates into their future careers, which carries on a future benefit.
I want to come back. I will come back about how one really sort of assesses the exact amount, because I want to introduce Professor Alan Duncan, who is an economist. He's director of the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre and Bankwest Professor of Economic Policy at Curtin University. And he's been very involved with NatSem, the modeller, and hails originally from Nottingham School of Economics at the University of Nottingham. So Alan, I wonder how, well, this would be music to your ears, this type of discussion, wouldn't it? But are you a bit surprised that the economic aspect of this has not been debated well or sufficiently?
Look, first of all, thank you very much again for the invitation. It's great to be able to talk with you. And yeah, I mean, I think I actually subscribe very much to the comments of the previous speakers, and I think Ted put it really, splendidly that it really touches every aspect of our lives. But in terms of the economics, it absolutely is the case that in direct terms there is a huge contribution to Australia's economy. But that is really just a fraction of the story. We're actually touching 40.3 billion now in direct export value from international education over the last full year, and I think later in the conversation we'll touch on how that's travelled over the first part of this year, because it's a really important story. But then, clearly beyond that, the indirect value to all sectors of the economy from the international education market, really covers, an enormous, it extends to an enormous sector of the sections of the economy. Around 23 or 24 billion if you add indirect value to the direct benefits from international education. I really do think that a few elements of the story are being overlooked to our detriment. One of which is the absolutely inextricable linkage between international students and the broader success and contributions that universities make to our economy and society. The research returns, for example, and the extent to which the innovation that comes through a university relies so strongly on the international education market. It's absolutely critical. And there's a real concern, I think, that in overlooking that, we're overlooking such important contributions to our productivity and our innovation, to entrepreneurship. The other aspect, again, which I think has been touched on really well, are the long-term returns to students studying at Australian universities. It is absolutely the case that the students of today become citizens of tomorrow in Australia, and they're bringing with them huge, benefits, great skills in innovation, and I think just opening up the sort of citizenship of this company to insights and inputs and stimuli from across the globe. So in terms of the research contribution, in terms of the long-term benefits to our society, these are all, for me, at least as important as the sort of the dollar direct and tangible returns.
No, well, thank you very much indeed, Alan. And I want to go back to Ted. I want to see your slides, Ted, as you do. It was very good of you to have prepared them. So can you maybe talk to them, please?
Yeah, happy to share these. Host disable participant screen sharing, and somebody's got to let me share.
I'm hoping that Damien's listening and can help you share.
Come on, Damien.
Damien, hear this. If not,
Sally, Damien.
I tell you what. No, well, look. While they're just working this out behind the scenes, what I get from all of you, and I will come back, Tip. What I get from all of you is that, like, I honestly think all of this is blindingly obvious as well, but it clearly isn't. And it must be more ephemeral. Like, I would have thought the 40.3 billion in direct and the 24, I think you said indirect, is a pretty staggering amount of money. But it's quite plain to me that one way and the other, the debate has not proceeded as if that matters so much, or that it can be, I don't know, retained in other ways. I just wonder how you, I'll just go to you, Ted, while you're waiting to be talked to.
Yeah.
But are you surprised at the fact that this didn't seem to be, here we are, a vital service sector, it just didn't seem to have the status that I thought it would?
Well, I think amongst people who know it's had enormous status, and there are interesting discussions now because in many respects it's evaporated overnight, particularly in Victoria. And I must admit, I shared the anxiety about the comment "time to go home." I wanted to kick myself when I heard that comment early on. But we tend to be a bit internationally complacent in this country. I think we probably assume we have a status that is way beyond what the rest of the world attributes to us. We punch above our weight, and it gives us maybe a self-confidence that we need sometimes to have rattled. And if this process rattles us, that will be a good thing. And if it reinforces what the Minister referred to as the priority of quality over quantity, I think that will be a good thing as well, because we do run a risk of erring on that.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we've got big numbers, and we have to make sure, and I could talk about this at length, that we're not just a market, but we're a magnet, and that we're not just merchants about education, we're actually masters of education. There's a difference. And Duncan Maskell, the new Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University, has talked about this in his speech as well, promoting the fact that, particularly obviously the University of Melbourne, has to recognise that it's a global university, and that the university contributes globally. We're not just educating international students, we're actually contributing globally. So the university has to be a magnet, and I think it's a distinction that is important for Australia, because the competitors now are spotting an opportunity, and it's going to be difficult unless we think completely differently about this. It will be a problem.
Well, now I find that very, very interesting. So in a way, you are, they're quite lofty sentiments that you're discussing there. And one of the things that's occurred to me is that, you know, we started talking about the business model, you know, in debating. I've done it on the ABC, you know, the business model of universities was a certain amount for international education that paid for research and all that sort of talk. And I thought, I wonder if the Australian community more generally expected universities to have business models. You see what I mean? Whether this was a bit of a challenge to their sense of what a university was. It might be an old-fashioned sense, but I'm going to ask you first and go to Alan, whether you think that this is part of the, ironically, economy discussion has not been easy to accommodate into a lofty model of educating.
Well, that's where the arguments got to currently with numbers, and it's a legitimate argument. What I'll show you in a moment, because I can share it from the others, we need to actually factor in that there is going to be an enormous growth in this sector above and beyond where we are now. And that's why quality will be important.
Right, okay. Now, because you're just fading in back. Now, Alan, what do you think about this? This sort of, you know, slight tension, I think, that exists there, but I might be wrong. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Look, no, I think it's a really perceptive point. I think there's perhaps a little bit of a middle way between conversations at the one end, which are very much about, you know, the benefits of you know, education and innovation to society, the sort of lofty model as you describe it, and on the other extreme, you know, a discussion which is purely about business, about the efficiency of you know, the sector in generating income and delivering cohorts of students into the marketplace. I think perhaps we are a little bit caught between those two stools, and maybe we're edging a little bit too much towards, you know, business. Maybe we're edging too much towards, you know, what's the scale of the sort of the tangible or financial value of international education. I do think that there is scope in the conversation just to evidence and highlight the raft of contributions that the international education sector, that universities generally make to society, far beyond, you know, delivering the future workforce and driving skills. I think there's a constellation of benefits that we can dwell on. Perhaps we can do a little bit of a better job at ourselves. I mean, that said, you know, the fact that we have a sector of the Australian economy that has, for the last 4 or 5 years, been growing in double digits percentage-wise. You know, we've had growth over the last 2 years in terms of the value of education exports of somewhere between 14 and 16% quarter on quarter. If you compare each quarter with the same quarter in the previous year, that is an enormous success story. And I think by any stretch, one has to celebrate that success. Now, of course.
So why hasn't it been, Alan?
Why hasn't it been celebrated? Well, yes. You know, again, I think I don't know whether or not there's a sense in which the universities, you know, live in some sort of comfort. If there is that misperception, it really has to be disabused quite strongly, because, you know, the universities are delivering just such strong outcomes, and in terms of the commitment of both the sort of leadership of the sector and its workforce to driving contributions towards research, innovation, education, linking with industry, all of these sorts of contributions have come with enormous effort and enormous planning and strategy. Yet again, the messaging does not seem to be driving home, and maybe it is because the sort of popular conception is of universities to be a little bit
above the fray.
Yeah. Geraldine,
go ahead.
If I can just buy in here, you know, it's an internal frustration for me that neither international education nor tourism has received anywhere near the acceptance or prioritisation during this COVID pandemic that we would have liked them to. And, you know, policy decisions are being taken in so many areas that totally ignore what it is that our sectors are contributing. But to some extent, I can understand that. I mean, if you look at the general culture of our communities right now, they're right down the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy table. They're sitting around, you know, being concerned about their safety and their lives, and we're continually having to reinforce to us that that's the place we're in. They're not at all thinking about this equation of return and economic value and so on. So I think now is a very difficult time for us to be, you know, putting out there the importance of the sectors, even though it is probably now more important than ever to reinforce that, because both those sectors, both our sectors in the services economy, need support during this time, and they're just not getting it. But I think that's because of this different situation we find ourselves in, and that the general community is not anywhere near considering those sort of issues. They're considering their own lives and their own safety.
But John, imagine if there was a sudden absolute plunge in the price of iron ore, and the whole of the northwest of Western Australia, where I'm from, suddenly collapsed. You just know it'd be on the front page, and yet the differences in that hard export earnings and the service industries, which I thought we were very interested in, it's quite stark, the difference in the debate.
Totally, but I think it is a process of our industries being pushed to the back of the pack because we are a greater threat to those whole sort of safety and life concerns than are those harder industries, and it's a lot more difficult for us to prosecute this agenda when we have those sort of concerns being constantly reinforced. I will say, though, that at the end of this, as we start to come out, the don't know what you've got till it's gone sort of mantra will come in pretty strongly, because we're going to be able to tell a tale that really is a tale of extreme woe as to where we've been over this period, but also a tale of a very bright future, because if we play this right, we will have students and we will have visitors from all walks of life wanting to come to Australia for those very values that we're currently battling. That whole culture of safety and the culture of protecting people's lives and livelihoods will become an absolute strength in promoting our country to visitors from an education or leisure or even a corporate point of view. We'll become the lucky country again that everyone will want to visit. And I truly believe that, but we have to play it right. If we are too slow to reopen the border and too slow to bring these sectors back to work, we're going to miss that opportunity. As strong as it is, it will fade very quickly, I believe.
How do you, just before I go back to Ted, who I think is ready to go, have you got any sort of sense? How do we watch this well? Have you got any sense when you think we will be able to wisely, or might start to think? I don't want to ask you about borders so much, but I want you to, how are you watching the competitiveness, the competitors?
Well, we're watching it incredibly closely. We've got, particularly through our marketing agency, Tourism Australia, we're monitoring every source country daily to look at changes, and we've got a model where we can remodel the outcomes based on all of the announcements country by country under a project we call Project Greenlight. So we're watching it extremely closely. We're starting to see some rays of sunshine cutting through the dark clouds, and I think we will see a return to some level of activity certainly before the end of the year. But it is dependent on the borders, albeit we have a few pilots that are likely to get underway shortly that will cut through that. So I think the news is good. If we can get a staged return, we need to be able to stipulate dates into the future when we can bring visitors back, whether they be students or whether they be leisure visitors and so on. But we've got to be clear about what that roadmap out looks like very soon. Otherwise, we're going to miss the boat.
Very interesting. Now, Ted, have you been told, because I haven't, whether we can see your slides?
Yep, I believe so. So I'm going to throw this up now.
Right.
And he says, hopefully, share. We've been talking about the current numbers.
There we are. Yep.
We've been talking about the current numbers and the problems we have, and you're quite right to compare education, certainly in Victoria, with Western Australia's iron ore. International education is our lead export in Victoria. And it has hit the wall. But look at the opportunity ahead. The top 8 in footy terms, population, next 30 years, India goes to the top, and I go quickly to the next slide. Nigeria leaping up there. Most Australians wouldn't have any idea about that.
No.
He says, going to the next slide, hopefully. How do I do that?
You want to make it big screen, the big one?
Wait. Let me. I just can't get to the next slide.
Go to there.
That one.
I'm so impressed with your game.
Here we go.
There you go.
And just looking at individual countries in that, and have a look at Australia down the bottom there, 8 million people extra. Look at India up the top. And when you look at that in our regional terms, to our northwest corridor, an extra 640 million people in the next 30 years. And on the African side, 1.3 billion. And China, Japan, and those countries actually go backwards in that time. So we have issues with the situation on the existing numbers, but this is enormous opportunity in front of us. And when you look at where the current age groups are, average age in Australia, around most of the Western world, and in China is around 37. Japan's much older. And India, 10 years younger. Pakistan, 15 years younger. Nigeria, nearly 20 years younger.
Gee, where's that Nigeria figure?
There is enormous opportunity in front of Australia in international education. And when you look at the spend, at the moment, China's spending an awful lot with Australia. There's a fair spend from India, but there is certainly huge opportunity given that growth in front of us. And there's visitors by country of origin, and John had recognised this chart. The future is so much bigger than the now we're struggling with. And if I can leap through a couple of slides, we have got a different world now. And something we have to recognise, it's not just us hurting, it's those from which our international students come are also hurting. So their demand for international education will slip a little. They will have less money, less disposable income. Obviously, travel and accommodation is just abruptly stopped. And our providers are shrinking as well. And we've got some reputational issues, some price issues, and competitors who are all over us. But if you just look at the numbers, and the ABC and ABS printed this over the weekend, 2019 arrivals and departures, look what's happened April to July. We've gone from 44,000 arrivals to 30, just 30. And that's obviously going to continue for a while. And the estimates about that are truly horrific. So there are now massive hesitations that we have to address in this country. And we have to think completely and utterly laterally, in my view, as to about how we're going to get through it. And I'll unshare that because I don't want to keep talking.
They're terrific. They really are fantastic slides. So you're very worried, Ted. You are sounding the clarion call.
Yeah. I think people have no idea, particularly in Victoria, how hard this is going to hit economically. Not only just in the international education sector, but we've also had a hit in the tourism sector, major events, hospitality, and in migration, because Victoria has thrived on migration for GDP growth for as long as I can remember. So all at once, it's a key strength which has taken a big hit. And if we're going to recover it, we have to be sensitive to the needs of those students and do stuff that's completely different. We may have to, I think John referred to, or one of the previous speakers referred to, the welfare package. And maybe if we're going to attract students in the future, we're going to have to do more in that regard with health insurance, throw it in. Maybe we have to throw in public transport concessions. Maybe we have to do a lot of things like that we haven't thought about before. Maybe sharing campuses locally. There'll be a restructure around this, but the opportunity in front of us is too big to just turn away from.
And who do you consider our key competitors, and what are they doing?
Well, obviously, Canada is a key competitor, but the US, China's now a much more mature education market in its own sense. And if you look at the graduation rates in China versus India and the student-teacher ratios in the relative countries, India's a natural ally for Australia. And I think if we play that correctly, we can make that work. But obviously the UK and the US as well, but Canada's a principal opportunity. And we have opportunities now, I think, with Hong Kong and Vietnam as well.
So I wonder, Kim Curtin, how you're hearing all this. I mean, they were fairly impressive slides that Ted put up. They're very confronting, of course, in many ways. But when you're sitting there in Treasury trying to assess the relative weight of different people's both dreams and realities, I mean, you know, does this hit you in the eye as something that has to be considered by governments?
Absolutely, and it's certainly, these are the sorts of figures we've been looking at ourselves, and it's a difficult position at the moment, balancing the economics and the health position. But obviously, as the health position is shoring up, we're having sort of moving on with our conversations. But certainly, as Ted was saying, we have still been focusing during the whole COVID on the welfare and looking after our international students. We still have over 150,000 international students in New South Wales right now who are already here, and we need to make sure that they're still, you know, being looked after, and will continue to be advocates for Australia when they return or stay in Australia. But certainly, as soon as we can, we're keen to get international students back, and I think skilled migrants was also spoken about. I expect it'll probably be a little more time before we can have tourists back, but even if we need to continue the quarantine process, a student who's coming here for 3 years to quarantine for 2 weeks is not a big deal. For a tourist who's here for a 3-week holiday, 2 weeks in quarantine is a bit of a problem. But certainly the conversations we're keen to get international students coming back as soon as sort of we can have agreement that we have a safe way to do that.
What if it takes subsidies from governments to actually ensure that the shock is reduced? I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? As to whether you think that the political debate within the community is such that politicians feel that they can say, look, this is a critical industry. I don't know whether it's there at the moment, that sense.
Well, there is, it depends, I guess, what you define as subsidies, but there's a lot of support already provided by all of the state governments in terms of supporting international students and the experience we give them. And Ted gave some of the examples of things that are considered.
He was outlining quite a lot more, though, wasn't he, that need to be done?
Yeah, and it's something that we are all talking about at the moment. So there's task forces have been put together on specifically focused on how do we get to the point where we can bring international students back, and how do we as a country compete against Canada, US, UK, Europe, who have, some of them have their borders open and can I guess get in first before our borders are opened up. But I think it was Alan saying, the story of how well Australia has coped with COVID will really, when we can bring students back, that will really help the messaging that we'll be selling as well. But for the desire of people to come back, I think will be there. But we need to be open to the fact that we've got some strong competitors around the world that we're going to have to go up against to attract those students to come back to Australia, and we can't ignore the fact that that's there.
I wonder, Alan, whether in a way, Alan and John, I'd like to hear this, whether that naming of the competitiveness, it's almost like the Australian, I'm thinking of how the Australian people is brought along with this in this next phase that we're heading into. How they can see it as an exciting prospect. It's almost like Australia versus the rest. Changing that debate, because I don't think the debate, you'd have to say that there has been less outcry from a lot of the Australian people who think about this extraordinary industry.
Look, I think you're quite right that there's a job to be done to try and bring the Australian society along to really generate an understanding of just how successful the higher education industry in Australia has been. And in that regard, I'm really drawn to what Ted had to say about what the future holds and how we are going to have to undertake something of a pivot to capitalise on our positioning. I do think it's instructive to draw parallels between the higher education sector and the resources sector. And there are a number of parallels that I think really give us lessons. One for me is the concentration to now on the origin of our international student base, we actually undertook an analysis, a concentration analysis. It basically allows you to capture to what degree the majority of the revenues are restricted to a small base of countries. Concentration has been rising consistently over the last 4 and 5 years. Around 55% of export revenues in Australian international education comes from 3 countries alone. There is an enormous opportunity to tap into demands across the globe. And in order to do so, I think we need to, cast our net far further afield without diminishing or casting adrift, the great strides that we've made in drawing demand from the Asian ring to Australia. But there's so much more of the globe that we can extend into in terms of appealing to the great strengths and the caliber of the Australian higher education sector. So I think that's really, really important. We also, I think, necessarily needs to consider why it is that as we've grown in double-digit terms over the last 3, 4, and 5 years, given the imposter has now hit over the last 6 months where revenues have declined, but only declined by about 4% nominal compared with the same time last year, why we are under such duress. And of course, it is because as we've grown, we've modified our expectations and our future trajectories to take account under the expectation that growth will continue into the future. I think in terms of the business model, there always needs to be a little bit of precaution there. Times are great at the moment.
Complacency that Ted was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, times have been terrific, and the sector has been growing really strongly. One always has to have half an eye on whether or not, for whatever reason, things may turn either for a single country or across the globe. And this is why the diversification agenda is so important. In business, we would not put all of our eggs in one or a few baskets. And I think the strength and the resilience of the sector could be really developed further if we considered exactly the prospectus that Ted lays out.
How do you think about that, John Hart?
Well, it's interesting. So the first observation I'd make is, as I said before, I think our competitive advantage here of the way that we've managed COVID will very quickly evaporate if we don't manage the restart effectively. Because countries that we draw students from, and I acknowledge Alan's point that we might need to change who they are from both an international ed and a tourism perspective, but they will view us as a positive place to come because of our safety and security for a while. But if this starts to drag on and they can't access Australia but can access our competitors, they'll go to our competitors. But at the moment, if you compare us to the US and you compare us to other markets, there's no way that students are going to go to those countries that have handled this poorly. But we've got to handle the way out really effectively. Secondly, we have to bring the community along with us on that journey. So unless we are able to convince the community of the value of the sector and the value of our companion sector in tourism, we're not going to get the government will to give us the pilots that we need to bring students in to show that we can move people safely. We won't be able to get the wholesale opening to various countries unless we can have the community attitude change. And I think we need to do that by telling the story. We've undertaken on the tourism side to start telling individual stories of people that have been affected by the sector and how they've been affected during the COVID crisis. It always makes the front page when you get a farmer that's been displaced or somebody that's gone through some sort of personal circumstance. That's what gets reported.
Victims lead.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, we need to have those stories as well, and we've got to tell them to the community. Finally, though, I just want to have a bit of an open dialogue about another part of the interdependence between tourism and international education, and that's airline capacity. If we come out of this looking very different as to where we are getting airline capacity and where we are not, then our source markets will have to change. If we don't see a return to a number of the Chinese carriers, for example, we are not going to get the visitation from a student or tourism perspective from China that we had previously. If we continue to have the disrupted airline access into India that we have had, bearing in mind that there is, the number of direct flights, were pre-COVID very small. One of the biggest barriers to travel post-COVID will be that people will want direct flights. They want to be able to hop on an aircraft and travel to a location. They don't want to stop and go through a transit area that they will view as unsafe. So it very much depends on how we rebuild aviation access, what the capacity story looks like, what the source countries look like, and what the means of travel, i.e. direct or having to transit looks like. That will very much determine what our tourism and international education industry looks like into the future, acknowledging obviously that there's some offshore delivery by some of the universities, but the majority are bringing students over. And if they can't get onto an aircraft, there's not much hope of bringing them to Australia.
Yes, it's very interesting. So it's inextricably linked. The sell, as it were, to the Australian people is both small and big, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There's an existential question there: is how big does the sector have to be before the sector has its own airline?
Oh, Ted.
Baillieu Airways.
Oh, dear. Okay, so just as we've only got about 7 minutes to go. So, I mean, these are all very, very interesting in terms of this next stage. I suppose I do have to ask you, John, then when must the next stage, however we define it, start? Like, you obviously standing there watching very carefully, trying to calibrate others' moves and our own. When do we have to really start getting on our bike and starting to persuade people who do pull big levers to open doors and to open checkbooks and so on?
Well, I think if we are not in a position to be able to have some pilots and trial activities happening before the end of the year, we're going to miss the boat. And the boat that we're going to miss is that community boat. What we have to be able to do is start with some trials and start to get people travelling so that we can prove to the community that travel is safe. We need to be bringing groups of students to Australia and showing that they've turned up on the doorstep, they've been through whatever quarantine is necessary, and they've come out the other side and we haven't had any negative impact. Similarly, we need to get the New Zealand bubble open within that time frame without quarantine, because that's obviously going to relieve pressure on the quarantine system, demonstrating that if we go from a country or a location that is safe to another location that is safe, there is no risk. And the community needs to see that. As soon as they hear of quarantine-free travel, or indeed travel at all, they immediately think of what's happened with the glitches in quarantine that's led to our second wave. So we need to demonstrate that this stuff is safe. We've got to do it by the end of the year, and we've got to tell the community about it when it happens.
I just wonder whether that is exactly where the international education could play a sort of be at the leading edge. I hadn't thought about this because I don't see the international borders opening until the new year. I've heard Alan Joyce talking about that, but you're really talking about a specific learning that could be quite important, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the data, to my knowledge, we haven't had one infection that has been created on an aircraft. No. And if you look at all of the data of all the quarantine and so on, yes, we've had cases that have come up in quarantine, but there has been no spread on an aircraft. And I'm sure the community think that that's not the case. I've heard people say it to me. They've said, I'm not prepared to get on an aircraft right now. The bottom line is, it is safer getting on an aircraft than it is on getting into a bus. So we really need to be able to get out there and prove to the community it's a safe thing to do. It's safe to bring people internationally. It's safe to have quarantine free from a low risk country or a low risk destination. And we've got to tell that story. And yes, international education is absolutely how we should do that.
What do you think about this, Ted Baillieu? It certainly made me aware that the whole discussion around in the services sector, which, you know, I've sort of believed the argument that it is our future, it seems it's a lot more boundaried, can I put it like that, when things go pear-shaped, as in COVID, by comparison with some of our other, you know, exports like the traditional ones, wheat and wool and iron ore. It's a different debate, isn't it?
Well, this is probably the first time the services sector has had such a big hit. We've obviously had financial downturns, but there's still been active opportunities internationally. So it is a huge, huge hit, particularly in Victoria. And John's absolutely right in terms of the key is getting access back, and that goes for accommodation as well. And I think one other thing that we probably need to look at, even if there are sunset clauses, is to work with the union and to ensure that there are employment opportunities for students, and the industrial system accommodates it without any resentment. And if there have to be sunset clauses on those so that we can get the industry back going again, so be it. But let's just think creatively. And if we even, you know, if you're thinking radically creatively, you know, can quarantine sites be campuses?
Right.
So that, you know, students arriving can go into quarantine and start work in quarantine. You know, that might be a locational thing. It might be something you have to progress through, but just some radical thinking to get the start going again, because it's going to be a very difficult start in some parts of the country.
There's none of that's happening yet, talking to unions, is it, like this sort of discussion?
Well, I can't vouch for that, but obviously with some of the matters that have been front page in the last few years, the innocent victims of those have been students who come from overseas, done jobs that nobody else wants to do, worked through the night, and now it's all fallen over on that side as well. So those who are trying to work while they're going through the current stop work kind of situation, they've been hit at both ends.
And maybe it will be final words to you, Alan, in terms of just this, you know, the nature of the debate, further to our discussion as to how we might have a different type of debate around this if Ted's right, that it's going to really test us in so many ways.
Yeah, look, I think it is going to test us. The numbers that have been coming out over the last 6 months, you know, testament to that. You know, the stakes are really, really high here. The international education sector has been a huge success story for some time. As we've talked about, the messaging around that perhaps is not as strong as it could be. But if you cut to brass tacks, you know, we as a broad rule of thumb, every extra 6.5 international students leads to one new job in Australia across the economy. But of course, the reverse of that is that, you know, every 6.5 international students lost means we lose a job. So the stakes are really, really high just in those sort of direct employment terms, you know, and, you know, that's got nothing to do with the, you know, the broader aim, which is to continue to drive forward with, you know, the sector as one of the great success stories that we have in Australia. We also need to really protect the sort of virtual circle that there is between the international students and the teaching side of the university's business and its research, because research is a massive value generator. There are various estimates about the value, the return on $1 of investment in research. You know, one study says $5 return on a dollar investment. One study says $9.50. But whatever it is, it's a significant number. And we have a real risk.
I don't think I've ever really heard that figure. Isn't that interesting? I never
Yeah,
had.
it should be. So I mean, the low figure was a Deloitte Access Economics study. The higher figure was a London economics study for the group of 8 universities. But I think it just evidences, you know, just the strength of contribution in terms of innovation, in terms of new ideas, in terms of creativity and entrepreneurship, that we can't lose sight of. And if we start to lose our position, if we start to lose our reputation as a global leader in higher education, then we risk the loss of all of those benefits. We risk the loss of talent. And with the loss of talent goes the loss of reputation. And with the loss of reputation goes a reduction in demand, because demand is very much reputation driven. So the stakes are really, really high. And to your question about when we should start thinking about it, yesterday. We should not wait any longer.
All right. Look, I'm just looking at the time. I think we're going to have to wrap up. So apologies, Kim, for not being able to come back to you. But I think you've made yourself quite clear that this is something that New South Wales Treasury is very interested in, which is wonderful. Look, thank you all very much indeed, Ted Baillieu, John Hart, Kim Curtin and Professor Alan Duncan. I think that's been a most rewarding, if challenging, nothing... well, you know, obviously there are clear and present dangers, and there are issues that have to be tackled and new ways of debating it. That's what I've certainly taken out of it, and I shall try to adapt that in some of the stories that I do on the ABC as well. So look, thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to have you complete session 1 and 2 of the first day, and we'll be back tomorrow. We're going to look very much tomorrow at an opportunity to discuss 2 of the states, for instance, who've been through the process of coordinating pilots of international students going to National Cabinet to run through the economic arguments that have been used and to just see how they do play out. So thank you all very much indeed. Join us again at 11 o'clock.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.